If you think silence means nothing is wrong, then you have never heard a mansion at 3:07 a.m. come alive in a way it was never meant to. William Carter had built his entire life around control, precision, and predictability, and at 62 years old, the billionaire believed even silence in his home had a schedule. Yet that night something broke the pattern. He woke up not because of fear, but because of something far more unsettling in a place like his house: inconsistency. At first it was faint, almost dismissible, a soft rhythm of water running where no water should be running at that hour. He sat up in bed, listening, convinced it was part of the building's automated system until he remembered every system in his home shut down automatically at midnight unless manually activated. That detail alone pulled him out of bed. William walked through the dimly lit hallway of his mansion in bare silence, the polished floor reflecting the low ambient lights like still water, and followed the sound toward the kitchen. What he saw through the partially open door did not match any expectation he had. Under the soft glow of the under-cabinet lights stood Emily Brooks, the 15-year-old daughter of his housemaid Angela, carefully washing dishes with a focus that seemed far too heavy for someone her age. The kitchen was spotless already, yet she continued as if something depended on it being perfect. William did not interrupt immediately. He simply observed, noting the tension in her shoulders, the quiet determination in every movement, and the way she kept glancing toward the clock as if time itself was chasing her. When he finally stepped inside, the sound of his presence made her freeze. Emily turned, startled but not panicked, as if she had already rehearsed being caught. William's voice was calm but firm when he asked what she was doing there at this hour, and why she was not in school like any normal morning. The question should have had a simple answer, but the silence that followed told him otherwise. Emily looked down at her hands, still wet, and said nothing at first, while the faucet continued to drip into the sink like a ticking clock. Moments later, Angela Brooks appeared at the doorway, breath slightly uneven as if she had rushed down from upstairs, and the expression on her face was not surprise but concern mixed with something closer to resignation. She quickly tried to explain that it was nothing, just a misunderstanding, just a habit that needed correcting, but William had spent too many years reading people in boardrooms to accept surface answers. Something about the way Angela avoided eye contact made the situation heavier than it appeared. Emily finally spoke, her voice soft, explaining only fragments at first, that school had become difficult, that mornings were complicated, and that she preferred to help at night so she would not fall behind in responsibilities during the day. Each word revealed less explanation and more pressure, as if she had been carrying a weight she did not know how to describe fully. William felt a shift he did not expect. This was not a story about disobedience or misunderstanding. It was something structured, something built over time through necessity rather than choice. And for the first time in years, the billionaire who believed everything had a logical cause found himself standing in front of a situation he could not immediately categorize. The quiet kitchen, the careful movements of a young girl trying to stay ahead of unseen problems, and the presence of a mother trying to protect her child all formed a picture that did not belong in a house like his, and yet it was now impossible to ignore. William Carter remained standing in the kitchen long after the silence settled again, watching the water drip from the faucet as if it might eventually explain what he had just witnessed, but silence in that moment offered nothing except more questions. Emily Brooks slowly returned to washing the dishes, her movements quieter now, more cautious, as though the presence of an observer had changed the rules of what she was allowed to do. Angela Brooks stood near the doorway without stepping fully inside, her hands clasped together in a way that suggested she was trying to hold back words that might make things worse. William finally spoke again, his tone controlled but no longer indifferent, asking Angela to explain clearly why a 15-year-old child was in a kitchen at 3 in the morning instead of being in school where she was supposed to be. Angela hesitated, then gave a carefully chosen explanation about schedule difficulties, school pressure, and the need for Emily to help at home. But each sentence felt incomplete, like parts of a larger truth were being intentionally left out. William had spent decades negotiating deals worth millions of dollars, and he recognized when information was being softened to survive scrutiny. He turned his attention back to Emily and asked her directly whether she had gone to school at all that week. Emily paused, her eyes fixed on the sink, and after a long moment she admitted she had missed several days. But she quickly added that it was not because she wanted to, only because mornings had become impossible to manage. The answer did not satisfy him. Instead, it deepened the unease growing in his mind. He asked what she meant by impossible, and this time her voice lowered even further as she explained fragments of her routine, waking up early to complete chores, trying to help her mother prepare for work, and then realizing that by the time she was ready, school had already become something she could not consistently reach on time. Angela stepped forward slightly as if to interrupt, but stopped herself, clearly realizing the situation had already moved beyond simple correction. William observed both of them carefully, noticing how Angela carried exhaustion in her posture, the kind that comes not from a single bad day, but from a long accumulation of pressure without relief. He also noticed how Emily spoke not with defiance, but with resignation, as if she had already accepted that her situation could not change. That realization disturbed him more than he expected. In his world, problems were usually the result of inefficiency or poor planning, both of which could be fixed with resources, yet what he was seeing here did not behave like a business problem. It behaved like something that had been quietly growing for a long time without intervention. He asked Angela directly if there were financial difficulties affecting Emily's schooling, and the question made the air feel heavier. Angela tried to deny it at first, insisting that everything was manageable, but her voice lacked conviction. After a moment, she admitted that school expenses had become harder to handle, that unexpected costs had accumulated over time, and that she had been trying to make adjustments without letting Emily feel the burden. William listened without interruption, his expression unreadable, but internally he was beginning to reconstruct the situation in a way that no longer matched the image of a stable household he believed he was providing employment within. He looked at Emily again, noticing how young she looked under the kitchen light, how out of place she seemed in a space meant for adults managing responsibilities far beyond her years. For the first time since waking up, William felt something shift that had nothing to do with business or control, but with awareness of consequences he had never directly considered. The mansion around them remained perfectly quiet, yet within that quiet there was now a tension that could not be ignored, as if the house itself had revealed a problem that had been living inside it unnoticed for far too long. The silence in the kitchen did not return to normal after the conversation ended. It only changed shape, becoming heavier in a way that made every small sound feel more noticeable than it should have been. William Carter remained standing for a moment longer, watching as Emily Brooks resumed her slow, careful movements, as if she was trying to erase the disruption his presence had caused, while Angela Brooks stayed close, her attention divided between her daughter and the man who owned the house they were standing in. William finally broke the stillness by asking a simple question about how long this pattern had been going on, and although his tone remained controlled, there was now something different beneath it, a level of seriousness that made it clear he was no longer observing casually, but actively trying to understand. Angela hesitated before answering, saying it had not been planned, that it had gradually become necessary over time, starting with small adjustments to sleep schedules and slowly expanding into a routine that no one had intended, but no one had been able to stop. Emily added softly that she did not mind helping, because it made her feel useful and reduced the pressure on her mother, but her voice carried a tone that suggested acceptance rather than genuine choice. William noticed that distinction immediately. He asked whether anyone at school had been informed about her absences, and Emily shook her head, explaining that she had tried to keep up, but eventually it became harder to explain repeated delays and missed days, so she stopped trying altogether. That statement created a new layer of concern for William, because it revealed not just a household issue, but a breakdown in structure outside the home as well. He turned slightly, looking at Angela again, and asked whether she understood the long-term impact of missing school at this stage of Emily's education. Angela lowered her gaze, her response delayed, and when she finally spoke it was clear she understood but felt trapped by circumstances she could not easily change. She explained that every decision had been made with survival in mind, balancing rent, bills, and basic necessities, and that school attendance had slowly become something they were forced to negotiate rather than guarantee. William listened without interrupting, but internally he began to recognize that what he was hearing was not a single problem with a single cause, but a chain of compromises that had built up over time until they became normal. He asked if there was any external support being used, any assistance programs or school counseling, and Angela admitted there had been attempts, but they had not been consistent enough to fully resolve the situation. Emily stood quietly during this exchange, her hands now dry but still resting near the edge of the sink, her eyes occasionally shifting toward the clock on the wall, as if she were still calculating time in a way that most children her age should never have to. William noticed that behavior and found it more revealing than anything spoken so far, because it showed a mindset shaped by responsibility far beyond her years. He asked Emily what she wanted for herself, not what she needed to do for others, and the question seemed to surprise her, as if she had not been asked that in a long time. After a pause, she said she wanted to finish school properly and not feel like she was constantly falling behind, but she quickly followed it with reassurance that she would continue helping her mother no matter what, as if her personal wishes had to be balanced immediately with obligation. That answer stayed with William longer than any of the logistical explanations. He realized that in trying to maintain stability, both mother and daughter had gradually normalized a situation that was quietly limiting Emily's future. The mansion remained still, the polished surfaces reflecting a world of order and wealth that now felt disconnected from what was unfolding in its kitchen. William looked at both of them again, and for the first time since discovering them that night, his thoughts shifted away from observation and toward responsibility, not because he had been asked to intervene, but because he could no longer ignore the imbalance sitting in front of him. William Carter did not leave the kitchen immediately after Emily shared what she wanted for her future. Instead, he remained still for several seconds, as if trying to calculate something that could not be measured with numbers or logic, while the quiet hum of the house continued around them. The contrast between the perfection of the mansion and the fragile uncertainty of the situation in front of him felt more noticeable now, and for the first time that night, he began to see his own home differently. He finally asked Angela Brooks if Emily had ever been formally evaluated by her school for attendance concerns, and Angela admitted that there had been occasional contact, but nothing sustained enough to change the pattern that had slowly developed. She explained that every time a solution seemed possible, another financial or scheduling issue would appear, forcing them to prioritize immediate survival over long-term planning. William listened carefully, not because he was judging, but because he was trying to understand how something so structured and stable from the outside could contain so much instability underneath. He then turned his attention to Emily again and asked if she felt tired during the day because of her nighttime routine, and she nodded slightly, admitting that it was difficult to stay focused in class when she attended, but she tried her best not to let it show. That answer confirmed something William had already begun to suspect, that the situation was not just about missed school days, but about a gradual erosion of normal childhood rhythm that most people take for granted. He asked Angela if she had considered adjusting work hours or seeking additional help at home, and she explained that she had tried to make changes, but limited resources made flexibility extremely difficult, and every adjustment created new challenges elsewhere. William noticed that every explanation, while reasonable on its own, formed a pattern of constant compromise that left no room for recovery. He looked at Emily and asked what time she usually went to sleep, and she hesitated before saying that it varied, sometimes late, sometimes very late, depending on what needed to be finished first. That detail settled heavily in his mind, because it explained the exhaustion he had observed earlier, and it also revealed how deeply the situation had affected her daily structure. For a moment, no one spoke, and the kitchen felt even quieter than before, as if the house itself was waiting for a decision that had not yet been made. William finally said that missing school at this stage would have consequences that extended far beyond the present moment, and although his tone remained calm, there was an unmistakable seriousness in his words. Angela lowered her head, acknowledging that she understood, but also expressing silently that understanding alone had not been enough to prevent the situation from developing. Emily looked between them, her expression uncertain, as if she were beginning to realize that the way she had been living was not something temporary, but something that could shape her future in ways she had not fully considered. William felt something shift again. Inside him, not as a sudden emotional reaction, but as a slow recognition that responsibility in this case could not be divided neatly between individuals, because the system around them had failed to provide balance. He asked Angela if she would be willing to allow him to review the situation more closely, including school communication and financial pressures, not as interference, but as an attempt to understand what had been overlooked. Angela hesitated, but eventually agreed, her voice quiet, but relieved that someone was finally willing to look deeper. Emily remained silent, but her posture changed slightly, as if the idea of not carrying everything alone had created a small, but noticeable release of tension. William observed that change carefully, realizing that even the possibility of support had an immediate effect. The mansion remained unchanged, but within its kitchen something fundamental had begun to shift, not in action yet, but in awareness, as William Carter started to consider that what he had discovered at 3:07 a.m. was not just an isolated moment, but the beginning of a responsibility he could no longer ignore. William Carter left the kitchen only after Angela Brooks agreed to let him take a closer look at the situation, but even as he walked back through the long hallway of the mansion, his thoughts remained fixed on what he had just learned. The house was still quiet, every surface still reflecting the same controlled perfection it always had, yet now it felt different to him, as if something beneath that order had been exposed for the first time. He stopped briefly near the window overlooking the garden, not because he needed rest, but because he was processing a reality that did not fit into the structured way he normally interpreted problems. Emily Brooks and Angela Brooks were still in the kitchen behind him, and for the first time he considered that their situation was not an isolated inconvenience, but a pattern that likely extended beyond what he had seen. Later that morning, instead of following his usual schedule of meetings and calls, William made an unusual decision to cancel part of his day, something that rarely happened in his routine-driven life. He requested access to household administrative records, including school correspondence and basic expense summaries related to dependents living in the property. When his assistant questioned the change, he simply stated that it was necessary, without offering further explanation. As he reviewed the information, the structure of what he had assumed to be a stable arrangement began to reveal inconsistencies that were subtle but significant. There were gaps in communication records, delayed responses from school notifications, and scattered financial entries that suggested ongoing adjustments rather than a stable plan. None of it pointed to negligence in a direct sense, but together it formed a picture of gradual strain that had never been fully addressed. William paused several times during the review, not out of confusion, but because he was realizing how easily these small signals could be overlooked when no one was actively looking for them. Meanwhile, downstairs, Emily attempted to continue her morning routine as if nothing had changed, but Angela noticed that her daughter was quieter than usual, occasionally distracted, as if the events of the night were still settling in her mind. Angela reassured her that things might begin to improve, though she herself did not fully know what that would look like yet. For Emily, the idea that someone had finally asked questions about her situation created a mixture of relief and uncertainty, because change, even positive change, often feels unfamiliar when stability has been defined by struggle. By late morning, William returned to the kitchen area and informed Angela that he would be coordinating directly with the school to understand Emily's attendance record and academic standing more clearly. He emphasized that this was not about blame, but about clarity, because without understanding the full scope of the situation, no meaningful adjustment could be made. Angela nodded, visibly relieved that the burden of explanation was no longer entirely on her shoulders. Emily listened quietly, her eyes shifting between her mother and William, as if trying to understand whether this new attention would bring disruption or relief. William then said something that changed the tone of the entire space. He explained that if the situation had developed gradually over time due to financial pressure and lack of support, then it was not something that could be corrected with temporary effort alone. It would require structure, consistency, and resources that had not been available so far. The statement was not emotional, but it carried weight because it acknowledged reality without judgment. For the first time, Angela allowed herself to exhale fully, as if she had been waiting years for someone to describe the situation without turning it into a personal failure. Emily, meanwhile, looked down at her hands, processing the idea that her difficulties were not simply her own responsibility to silently endure. The mansion remained unchanged around them, but the dynamic within it had shifted in a way that could not be reversed. William Carter was no longer simply an observer of an unexpected situation. He was now actively engaged in understanding what would be required to change its direction, and that realization marked the beginning of a decision that would extend far beyond that single morning. By midday, William Carter had already made 3 separate calls, none of which were part of his usual business schedule, and each one was directed toward understanding a situation he had only discovered hours earlier. The first call was to the private academic liaison connected to Emily Brooks' school. The second was to a financial consultant responsible for household-related expenditures, and the third was to a legal advisor who specialized in educational support frameworks. None of these conversations were emotional in tone, but each carried an increasing sense of urgency as more fragments of information were assembled into a clearer picture. What emerged was not a single failure point, but a gradual accumulation of overlooked strain that had never been formally addressed or escalated. Emily's attendance record showed intermittent presence, with gaps that had been informally explained but never properly resolved. Financial records indicated that Angela Brooks had been managing inconsistent expenses, often prioritizing immediate needs over long-term stability, which created a cycle that repeated itself without interruption. William listened to each explanation carefully, not interrupting, but internally recalibrating his understanding of what responsibility meant in this context. Later that afternoon, he returned to the main living area where Angela and Emily were seated quietly, both aware that the situation had shifted beyond a private household matter into something more structured and official. Angela appeared tense but cooperative, while Emily remained unusually quiet, observing rather than participating, as if waiting to understand what would happen next. William began by explaining what he had learned in simple terms, avoiding technical language, stating that Emily's academic situation had been affected by a combination of missed attendance, financial pressure, and lack of consistent support structures. He made it clear that this was not about assigning blame, but about identifying what had failed so that it could be corrected. Angela listened with visible relief, as if finally hearing an explanation that did not place the full weight of responsibility on her alone. Emily, however, seemed more focused on the idea that her situation had been documented and analyzed, something she had not expected, and that realization made her both curious and slightly overwhelmed. William then proposed a plan that was direct but carefully measured. He stated that immediate steps would be taken to stabilize Emily's school attendance, including coordination with the school to ensure her return to a consistent schedule. He also explained that additional financial support would be arranged in a structured way, specifically designed to eliminate the unpredictable gaps that had previously forced difficult choices. Angela hesitated at first, not because she disagreed, but because accepting assistance so clearly defined felt unfamiliar after years of managing everything independently. William acknowledged this hesitation and made it clear that the intention was not to replace her role as a mother, but to remove the external pressures that had distorted her ability to maintain balance. Emily finally spoke during this discussion, asking quietly whether she would still need to work at night or continue adjusting her sleep schedule around household responsibilities. William responded without hesitation that her primary responsibility moving forward would be education, and that her daily structure would be reorganized to support that priority rather than compromise it. The simplicity of the statement carried significant weight because it represented a shift from survival-based decisions to future-oriented planning. For a moment, the room remained silent again, but this time the silence felt different, less heavy and more uncertain in a way that suggested possibility rather than strain. Angela lowered her gaze, visibly processing the idea that she no longer had to solve every aspect of the situation alone, while Emily appeared to be absorbing what it meant to have her time and energy redirected towards something stable. William observed both of them carefully, recognizing that the changes he was proposing would not resolve everything immediately, but they would interrupt the cycle that had defined their lives up to this point. The mansion around them remained unchanged, but within it, a new structure of responsibility was beginning to form, one that extended beyond observation into active reconstruction of what had previously been left unresolved. In the days that followed, the atmosphere inside the mansion shifted in ways that were subtle but impossible to ignore, as William Carter began implementing changes that turned what had once been an isolated moment of discovery into a structured intervention. Early that morning, he arranged a formal meeting with the school administration, ensuring that Emily Brooks would be reinstated into a consistent attendance schedule with direct communication channels established between the school and his office. This was not presented as an exceptional favor, but as a necessary correction to restore stability. Angela Brooks observed these developments with a mixture of relief and disbelief, as if she had become accustomed to expecting problems to continue indefinitely rather than resolve themselves so directly. Emily, on the other hand, remained quiet during most of the preparations, absorbing the changes without fully expressing how she felt about them, as though she was still adjusting to the idea that her life was being reorganized around something other than constant urgency. William also introduced a structured financial arrangement designed specifically to eliminate the irregular pressures that had previously forced difficult compromises. Instead of unpredictable gaps and emergency decisions, there would now be a stable system in place that ensured essential needs related to education and living arrangements were consistently covered. He explained this clearly to Angela, emphasizing that the purpose was not dependency, but stability, allowing her to focus on her role without being forced into impossible trade-offs. Angela listened carefully, and for the first time in a long while, she did not feel the need to defend every decision she had made in the past, because the conversation was no longer centered on fault, but on correction. Emily's daily routine also began to change almost immediately. She no longer woke up before dawn to complete household tasks, and instead was given a structured schedule that prioritized school attendance, rest, and academic recovery. At first, this change felt unfamiliar to her, as if she had been removed from a pattern she had learned to navigate instinctively, even if that pattern had been exhausting. She often found herself unsure of how to use the additional time that had suddenly become available to her, simply because she had not experienced that kind of space in a long time. William noticed this adjustment period and made a conscious effort not to overwhelm her with expectations, instead allowing her to gradually adapt to the idea that her time could now be directed toward her own development rather than constant obligation. One afternoon, as Emily returned from school earlier than usual, she hesitated at the entrance of the kitchen, as if uncertain whether she still belonged in a space that had previously been defined by responsibility and urgency. Angela noticed this hesitation and gently reassured her that things were different now, not because their circumstances had been erased, but because they were no longer carrying them alone. William observed this interaction from a distance, recognizing that the emotional transition was just as important as the structural one. He understood that stability was not achieved through a single decision, but through repeated reinforcement of a new reality until it became familiar. At the same time, he also began to reflect on his own assumptions about the household he had been overseeing, realizing that proximity did not always guarantee awareness, and that systems could appear functional on the surface while quietly accumulating strain underneath. As the days continued, Emily slowly began to show small changes in behavior, not dramatic or immediate, but noticeable in the way she no longer appeared constantly preoccupied with time, and in the way she began to engage more openly during conversations at home. Angela also appeared less burdened, no longer forced to divide her attention between immediate survival and long-term concerns in the same way as before. William remained involved, but in a more measured capacity, ensuring that the structures he had put in place were functioning as intended without inserting unnecessary pressure into their adjustment. What had begun as a single unexpected observation at 3 a.m. had now evolved into a sustained effort to correct an imbalance that had existed quietly for far longer than anyone had initially realized. And within the walls of the mansion, a new sense of equilibrium was slowly beginning to replace the tension that had once defined it. Weeks passed, and the changes inside the mansion no longer felt like adjustments, but like a new normal slowly taking root in every corner of daily life. Emily Brooks had returned to a consistent school routine, and while she was still adapting to the pace of regular attendance, the structure around her no longer collapsed under pressure each morning. Angela Brooks also began to experience a level of stability she had not known in years, as financial uncertainty no longer dictated every decision she made. William Carter continued to monitor the situation quietly, not as an overseer looking for control, but as someone ensuring that the systems he had put in place were functioning as intended. One late afternoon, Emily returned from school and found William in the study, reviewing documents, and instead of quietly passing by as she once would have, she paused and greeted him in a more natural way than before. It was a small change, but one that signaled something deeper had shifted in her sense of belonging within the home. William acknowledged her with a simple response, then asked how her classes were progressing, not in a formal or interrogative tone, but with genuine interest in her adjustment. Emily hesitated briefly before answering, then explained that while the workload was still challenging, she was beginning to feel more present in class rather than constantly trying to catch up. Angela, who had been passing through the hallway, overheard part of the conversation and stopped for a moment, realizing that she no longer felt the same constant tension that had once defined her mornings and evenings. That realization carried an emotional weight she did not immediately express, but it was visible in the way she paused before continuing her routine, as if acknowledging that life had become more manageable in ways she had stopped expecting. Later that evening, the three of them found themselves in the kitchen at the same time, not because of urgency or obligation, but because of ordinary daily rhythm. Emily was preparing a simple snack after finishing her homework. Angela was organizing light household tasks, and William was reviewing messages on his phone while occasionally observing the calm interaction between mother and daughter. The silence in the room was no longer heavy or uncertain. Instead, it carried a sense of normality that had been absent during their first encounter in that same space. Emily eventually spoke about a school assignment, asking William a question about a topic she was struggling to understand, not because she needed permission, but because she felt comfortable enough to ask. William responded in a straightforward manner, offering a brief explanation without turning it into a formal lesson, and Emily nodded as she processed the information, visibly more engaged than she had been weeks earlier. Angela watched this exchange quietly, recognizing that her daughter was beginning to reconnect with aspects of life that had been overshadowed by survival routines for far too long. After Emily left the kitchen to continue studying, Angela turned to William and expressed a simple acknowledgement that things had changed more than she ever thought possible in such a short time. William did not respond with emphasis or pride, only stating that stability requires consistency, not sudden transformation, and that the real measure of success was whether the environment allowed growth to continue without constant disruption. Angela understood the meaning behind his words and nodded, accepting that what they had built together was still something that required care to maintain. As the evenings settled across the mansion, William remained in the study longer than usual, reflecting not on the intervention itself, but on how easily significant problems can exist unnoticed when they are hidden beneath functional routines. He realized that what had started as a chance observation at an unexpected hour had become a reminder that awareness carries responsibility, even when it arrives without invitation. Outside, the house remained quiet, but it was no longer the kind of silence that concealed tension. It was the kind that signaled balance, fragile but present, shaped by decisions that had finally brought attention to what had long been overlooked. Months after that first night at 3:07 a.m., the mansion no longer felt like a place defined by silence hiding tension, but rather a place where silence had finally been replaced by routine, structure, and a sense of stability that had slowly grown into every part of daily life. Emily Brooks had settled into her school life with a consistency that no longer required reminders or intervention, and although she was still young and still learning to adjust, there was a noticeable confidence in the way she now managed her time. Angela Brooks also appeared lighter in her daily movements, no longer carrying the constant pressure of unpredictable decisions, and instead focusing on maintaining the balance that had been established for her and her daughter. William Carter observed these changes quietly from a distance, not as someone who needed to control outcomes, but as someone who understood the importance of ensuring that progress remained steady rather than temporary. One afternoon, Emily returned from school earlier than usual and found William in the garden, standing near the edge of the walkway where he often took calls, though this time he was not speaking, only observing the quiet surroundings. She approached him without hesitation, something that would have been unlikely months earlier, and told him about a project she had completed at school that she was proud of. There was no nervousness in her voice, only a simple confidence that reflected a growing sense of self that had been slowly rebuilding over time. William listened carefully and asked her a few questions about the project, not to evaluate her, but to understand how she was experiencing her education now compared to before. Emily explained that she no longer felt like she was constantly trying to catch up, and that she was beginning to think about what she might want to pursue in the future, even if she was still uncertain about the details. Angela, who was nearby tending to the garden, overheard part of the conversation and paused briefly, realizing that the conversation was no longer about survival or immediate pressure, but about possibility and direction. Later that evening, the three of them sat in the living area of the mansion in a way that felt natural rather than structured, with Emily completing homework, Angela organizing small household tasks, and William reviewing correspondence related to ongoing administrative arrangements. The atmosphere between them no longer carried the weight of unresolved tension, but instead reflected a quiet understanding that their lives had stabilized into a more sustainable rhythm. At one point, Emily asked William a question about future educational opportunities, not because she was uncertain about the present, but because she was beginning to think beyond it. William responded by explaining that opportunities would always depend on preparation, consistency, and support systems, and that she now had access to all three in a way that allowed her to plan without fear of instability. Angela listened quietly to this exchange, recognizing how different it was from the earlier days when every decision felt like a compromise between immediate need and long-term uncertainty. As the evening progressed, William found himself reflecting on how a single unexpected moment had gradually reshaped not only the lives of Angela and Emily, but also his own understanding of responsibility within the environment he had created. He realized that stability was not something that simply existed because resources were available, but something that required attention to details that could easily be overlooked if no one was actively looking for them. Emily eventually finished her homework and left the room with a simple goodnight, no longer hesitant or uncertain in her movements, but steady and calm. Angela followed shortly after, expressing gratitude in a quiet and sincere manner that did not need elaboration to be understood. William remained alone for a moment longer, looking out over the quiet estate, recognizing that what had begun as an unexpected discovery in the middle of the night had evolved into a lasting change that extended beyond correction into genuine restoration. The mansion remained as it always had, but the meaning within its walls had changed, shaped not by wealth or structure alone, but by awareness that had finally been followed by action, allowing a fragile situation to become something stable enough to continue growing on its own.